Okay, so since the fuel system's done, I've just got all the parts for the engine in to actually start rebuilding it. I'm gonna clean up this big mess, roll the car out of here, and get the engine stand all set up, and we'll start working on it. Alright, so I got the garage cleaned up, got the engine stand ready to go. So now we're just going to go ahead and get the plate there bolted up onto the block. So I'll stand the block up, bolt the plate on, and then we'll get it put onto the stand and get ready to start building it. Alright, I know it's a little bright, I've got that sun beaming in here, but... So this is the underside, and all of the entire block, first of all, has been hot tanked. It's been cleaned, jet washed, so all these components are all cleaned off. These were kind of like a little gritty before, a lot better. These all have the bearings in them, and they've all been checked. They have the clearances written on them. We've got 2, 2.1, 2.1, 2, 2. So great on the clearances. Those are all been checked. I just touched those, and I've got the filings from the honing process on there. So that's one thing we still have to do, is to to final wash the block. So we've got to go through and actually clean the entire block with water, soap, just make sure the entire thing is clean. Hit it with some light oil to keep it from rusting, and then we can finally do the assembly. So I'm going to roll it over here. You can see this casting is way cleaner than it was. This was not looking this clean before. So it got, as you notice, all the freeze plugs are back in. These are all the new freeze plugs that I had purchased. And turning it over a little further, we can see that deck. It's looking really nice. So they went through and decked the top of the block to even it out. So this is completely flat now. Each of the cylinders have been bored out to the appropriate size, been chamfered at the top here. Looks like all of these holes were also chamfered. So this is pretty much ready to go. There was a little teeny nick that occurred on the side right here. This thing got bumped into something, and it's kind of coming up, so I'm just going to hit that with a deburring tool with a file really quick. Just knock that little high spot down. But otherwise, this should be ready to go. It's still covered in machine oil from the honing process. So this is still all kind of dirty. I'll have to wash it out. But other than that, it's looking really good. I'm really excited about this. So I get the new thread chasing tools in tomorrow. I've got a whole set coming in tomorrow. So that's when I'll start doing the assembly, because I want to make sure that all these holes get chased out, cleaned properly. So gonna do all that, and then once those come in, I'll start on the reassembly process. Okay, so getting ready to assemble the engine. So this is the thing that a lot of us are waiting for, myself included. So I wanted to kind of go over some of the stuff that you're going to need to put together this engine. This is just stuff that you should probably have. You don't necessarily have to have it, but this is the stuff so far through my research that I've figured out that I'm going to need while I'm putting this thing together. This is all the parts that came back from the machine shop. So I've got my pistons, rods, this is the fasteners for the head. All that stuff they've checked. The other stuff that I'm going to be using is the gasket set here from Felpro. This has a whole bunch of the gaskets coming to actually assemble the engine. So the next thing is the head gasket. So this is what we're going to be using to bolt the head onto the block. You're also going to need all the O-rings and seals for the engine. So front main seal, rear main seal, the oil pickup, gaskets, and all those little things. So on to the tools. Tools you're going to need a good set of ratchets and sockets. Make sure that they're good quality, you know, that you're not going to be stripping things, especially when it comes to some of these fasteners. If you're using specialty fasteners, some of these come with these spline bolts that they look like a spline. So make sure that you have something that will engage these types of nuts so that you're not going to strip those out as you're torquing them down. Speaking of torque, you're going to need a good set of torque wrenches. Now, these are CDI torque wrenches. I got them on Amazon. They're not that crazy expensive. And honestly, you're probably only going to need this kind of 3/8 middle of the road one. There's a bigger 1/2 inch that's great for doing things like wheel nuts and things like that. Torque wrenches tend to be most accurate near the center of their range. So the further and further out you go from the center, the less accurate they are. Usually they're fairly accurate out until, you know, the last 10% of their range, where things tend to be a little further off. Let's say, you know, around 50 foot-pounds, perfect torque wrench for it. If this needs something higher, then I'm going to go to my 1/2 inch, which goes up to 250 foot-pounds. If I need something lower, then I've got a 1/4 inch model here, and this guy goes, you know, in inch-pounds. So this is for a lot of smaller stuff, doing your valve cover and whatnot. Those things are specifying like maybe 9 foot-pounds, maybe like 7 foot-pounds. That's where this can come in handy, because you're not going to over torque with this. Measuring is a big thing. I'm going to have to go through and grind all the rings to spec in order to tell how much clearance I've got in those ring end gaps. I have to measure that while it's on the board, and to do that I'm going to use a set of feeler gauges. Now, feeler gauges are these thin little strips of metal. They're in various thicknesses, and it's written across the top which thickness it is. So this is a set from Itutoyo. They're honestly not that expensive. I think I paid like $8 for this set, but a good quality set of feeler gauges is necessary for when we do the end gap. If you're doing the head work, you're also going to need one to do the valve clearances from the camshaft to the bucket. You're going to have to check that clearance. So you also use feeler gauges for that. So good thing to have around. It comes in handy a lot. Now, depending on how much work your shop is doing to the engine, or if your shop's not doing work at all and you're going to be just doing a simple rebuild, you're going to need to check clearances. I talked about this in an earlier video where we measured the clearances of the crankshaft, the camshafts, that kind of thing. So it's good to have a set of micrometers if you're going to be doing that, so you can just double check everything, make sure that they're the right size. To that same effect there, if you want to really check your clearances for the bearings, you're going to need plastic gauge. So this is something that you put in there, you clamp it down, and it'll kind of smear out, and the red, these lines here, these thicknesses, are actually showing what the clearance is based on how far this little round piece of kind of like squishy plastic has spread out as you clamp down those mains. So this is useful for double checking that everything is going to be clearanced properly. Now, for doing the pistons themselves, we're going to have to do the ring grinding. So I have a piston ring grinder here. This is pretty cheap. I think this is like maybe $40 or so. It's pretty simple. It's basically just a grinding disc and some studs and a handle here connected to it. Not a whole lot. But what this will do is make sure that as you're grinding those rings, you are grinding them basically flat, because if you try to use a file to grind your rings, you can actually grind them at an angle, and that will cause a problem. So this is easy to do. I've heard it takes off quite a bit though, so we'll have to be careful with it, but a good tool to have if you're going to be grinding your own piston rings. Now, to install those rings onto the piston, you're going to need some piston ring installers. You can spread them out and snap them on by hand, but the rings are fragile, they're somewhat brittle, so it may behoove you to buy a set of piston ring installers. I think this was like less than $10. It's really simple. You slide the rings into these ends and you spread this apart, and this will spread them out. So you just spread it out just enough to get it over the piston, slide it down, and release. Now, to install the completed piston into the block, you have to compress those rings. So there's a few different ways to do that. There is the style where you have kind of like a crank and you just ratchet it closed, and it's a thin piece of metal with a strap around it. There's the kind that is a split thicker piece of metal. It's usually aluminum, and that has an adjustment on it to adjust it to the exact size you need, the exact diameter you need to shrink them down to. That's a little better. Arguably, the easiest way to install a piston into the bore is to use a single-size piston installer. Now, this is an 84mm installer from ARP. The way that these work is that the inside is bored at a taper, so the top here is wider than the bottom. You put the piston in the top, you push it down through, drop this into the block, and then you push it all the way through, and this will compress those rings down so they slide right into the bore. Really easy to use. Unfortunately, these are only a single size, so you have to purchase the size that you need, and you can't use it for anything else. I don't plan on rebuilding that many engines, so I just picked this guy up because I want to have the best experience installing the pistons that I can. One more tool you're probably going to need, especially if rebuilding an engine, is a set of thread chasers. These are commonly called thread restoration kits, and basically they consist of what looks like taps and dies. The difference here is that these pieces are designed not to tap, but just to clean and reform threads. So if you have a deformed thread on a bolt, or you have a hole that got galled or something like that, or there's some extra junk in there you're just trying to clean out, that's what you want to use these for. If you use a tap, the tap can recut the threads, and if it recuts those threads, you're no longer going to have a tight fit of the screw into the hole, or the bolt into the hole. Last but not least, assembly lube. Now, the reason to use this and not just motor oil is that this tends to be thicker and stickier than motor oil. It is miscible in the motor oil, so it's not going to harm it, but this stuff is designed to stay where you put it. So when you kind of goop it in there onto those bearings, it's going to stay where it was put, and it's not going to leak out and ooze away from those areas. So that's going to offer you the most protection when the engine's first started, before the oil pump is primed, before any of that stuff is started to work. It's going to give you the most protection on all those bearings possible until that oil comes in and can start to flush this out and replace it with actual oil. A couple extra things you may or may not need. Thread locker, we got some Permatex medium and some Loctite blue. And also make sure that if you're using aftermarket studs, aftermarket fasteners, that you use the lubricant provided with them and torque to spec. This is ARP fastener. Some of the lubricant, it's very thick. It's definitely not motor oil. The reason why is that this has a certain viscosity, and this will give the correct torque value when you tighten it. If the lubricant used is too thin or too thick, you can run into issues where you're either over torquing or under torquing a fastener. And the fasteners here that I'm using are designed to run at a certain torque, which is actually higher than the factory torque in the engine block. So because of that, we need to make sure that we use the correct fastener lubricant. So that was ARP's. For the rods, Carrillo has their own studs that they use, their own fasteners, so they have their own assembly lubricant. So that's a quick overview of the tools I'm using. I'm sure there'll be others, but the main ones right here. All right, so the next day, we're ready to do the engine wash. Stopped by Bed Bath & Beyond and picked up a couple things. Grabbed this this weird long, I guess it's for cleaning straws out, but this should work well for oil passers in the head. I got a smaller brush just for miscellaneous stuff around the engine. Clean that up. And I grabbed the cheapest toilet brush I could find because the toilet brushes are about the right size for the cylinders, so easy to clean there. So, and this is all These guys, this is metal, but not a big deal. I'm mainly going to be using this in the head, but the rest of this is all plastic, so it shouldn't cause any issues on the metal. So let me wheel the block outside, and I got to move the car, and I'll wheel the block outside, and we'll get washing. Alright, just going to use some Ajax in there, just some dishwashing soap. Alright, so just a quick overview there of the engine. There is it all complete. As you can see, everything is nice and clean. There's not really any rust or anything on there. The cylinder walls are clean. Everything is sprayed down with WD-40 so to keep any water off of it, or to drive any of the water that was left over off the metal. Give it that light oil coating so that it's protected. But yeah, otherwise, this is looking pretty clean. Flip it over. See the other side, and there you go. I'm going to go through and wipe this off again because I see like a little bit of what looks like water in there, so I'm going to go ahead and clean that off. But yeah, this looks pretty good. So let me go ahead and finish cleaning that up and take it back inside. So I realized I haven't actually talked much about what the machine shop did to the block, the head, all the components here. So starting with the block, the biggest thing we did was have them bore the cylinders. The cylinders have been bored out to 40 thousandths over, or 84 millimeters. 40 thousandths over the stock size of 83 millimeters. The next thing they did was to deck the block, and that is where they go and take a fly cutter across the head and deck this flat. So they've taken out 1 or 2 thousandths just to get this down to a completely flat surface with a certain roughness, and that's so that the head gasket seals properly, and that when the head comes down onto here, the head also has that same level of decking. It's decked to the same flatness, so when the two come together, they come together perfectly on that head gasket, so there won't be any leaks. The next thing that they did was to align bore all of the mains. So the mains are these 5 bearing journals here, these bearing holders that carry the crankshaft, and basically they clamp the crankshaft into the block. So doing it in a line hone basically aligns all of these mains to be perfectly straight, so along with the crankshaft, so that when you drop the crankshaft into here, everything lines up correctly, to within under 1/1000th of an inch. They also go through and hone the bearing surfaces to the proper size for the new bearings that are going in. The bearings are accurately measured, and then these holes here, these divots in this casting are honed with the main caps on them to the correct size to accept the bearings, so that there's the proper amount of tolerance between the crankshaft's journal, that's the smooth area on the crankshaft that rides in the bearing, and the inner size of the bearing itself. So there's actually a couple thousandths tolerance, and that's taken up by oil. So as the oil is injected through these holes by the oil pump, that actually flows in the bearing, and that oil is what the crankshaft rides on. It does not actually ride on the metal. That's why it's very important to keep oil flowing to the engine so you don't run into an issue where you have metal-to-metal contact that generally destroys the bearings and can ruin the engine. Now the other reason for reboring or realign honing the mains here is because we're going to studs. Now from the factory they use a bolt in these main caps to hold it in. So it's just a standard bolt with a head, threads down inside, clamps the main cap on. In this instance we're going to studs. So the stud is just a piece of metal that's threaded on either end. That's screwed down into this hole, and then as the main cap is dropped on, a nut is threaded down onto the end of it. That clamps the main in. Now those also use a higher torque value. So instead of the factory, say 40 foot-pounds, they're going to be using 60 or 70 foot-pounds. It's not accurate, don't quote me on that. We'll get to that in a minute. But because of that, the casting actually shifts slightly. The higher torque value causes more crush, it causes things to shift around. So this is align honed with those caps torqued with the new studs to their proper value. So because of that, now you've got the correct movement in this block at the new torque value, and because of that, now the align hone is going to make sure that all of these are accurate at that new higher torque value. Now the bulk of the work was done on the head, so the block had some stuff done to it, but the other big thing was the head, and that's a lot more work because of all the little parts involved. So what we had done was I went through and ported and somewhat polished this. So this is actually a pretty clean surface now. It's very smooth inside the combustion chamber. We also ported out the intake and exhaust ports in the head. Now what the machine shop did was to recut the valve seats. I have brand new valves in here. There's Inconel exhaust valves and standard intake valves. The exhaust valves are actually 1 millimeter larger in diameter as well, so there's a little bit better flow. Now what they had to do, because these are new valves and because the valve seats were tagged a little bit while we were going through and cleaning this up, they had to recut them. So the valve seats were cut on a machine which has a little slider that goes into here, and they drop down a cutter and it cuts the proper multi-angle valve seat, and that same seat is kind of cut into the valve. The valve is then put in there and lapped into place, so it's cleanly cut into the new seal, or the new seat, sorry, and then the two are lapped together so they form a really tight seal. As well, there's new springs that were installed, the dual springs, along with the titanium retainers, the new spring seats, so the seats that sit down in the engine, because they're steel springs, if you don't use the proper seats, it'll cut into the aluminum. So after that's done, they actually have to put the valves in. They have to tip the valves too, because the valves are slightly longer stock. Well, I should say these valves come longer than the factory valves. And the reason is that because if you regrind a camshaft, it generally has a smaller diameter slightly, and that's to take up that extra room. Since I'm using the stock camshaft, don't really need all that extra room. So that means that the valves need to be ground down a little bit at the tip to take that into account. So tons of work goes into this head. Now one of the things I wanted to do is have a real definitive, like this is how you put your engine together kind of thing. But I did a lot of research on this topic, and it's honestly, it's a real kind of wide and varied field of different things people do, different reasons for doing them. What I want to do is I'm just going to show how I do it. There's a whole bunch of great videos on YouTube. Honestly, Pete's Garage is one of them. He's got a lot of really good videos on building engines and the reason why he's doing it. He does what he does, which is excellent. So I'm just going to go through and I'm going to put it together kind of in a mixture of ways, just the ways that I feel best from all these different sources that I've kind of compiled together in my head. The best way that I've found to do this. So, okay guys, I know that was a super long video to sit through, and I hope you learned something out of it, or you just got something out of it, or even just understood what I'm trying to do. But I just want to go ahead and cut it off there because this thing's getting really long. It's like 30 minutes already. So I just want to go ahead and push all the actual engine building into the next video. So thanks for watching this. I'm sorry that there's not actually any goodies in here, but I'll see you in the next video, and I'll definitely have some good tidbits of what I'm doing in there. Thanks.